Alrighty, welcome everyone back to another Tuesday API review. Today is build, so if you watch this stream, you're probably doing something terribly wrong. You should probably be on the build side, but we love you no matter what. So then I think we get started with this one here. Alexei, are you on the call?
Yes. Hey, thanks. So this is about connecting together kind of two aspects of hot reload. So on the one hand, we have this attribute create new on metadata update, which is marking types as reloadable types. So this tells the runtime that there's nothing interesting about the state of these objects. And when Roslyn makes a hot reload change to them, Roslyn just generates a brand new type instead of trying to modify an existing one. And so that's one thing. The other thing we have in hot reload is the metadata update handlers, which allows frameworks to run some code when an update happens. And so the metadata update handler specifies a couple of methods, and those methods get a list of types that get the list of types that were updated by a particular change. So what this proposal is about is an extra attribute, metadata update original name. And so the idea is that if you have one of these reloadable types, when Roslyn generates a new version of it for a delta, it gets some kind of a mangled name. And so we have kind of two options. One is we can precisely specify what the algorithm is for generating these names, and then if a framework receives an update and it sees one of these classes with one of these mangled names, it could demangle it and figure out what the old version of the type was. The other option is we can just stick an attribute on the new generated type that says my previous name, the name that the user originally wrote is abc.derived class or whatever it happens to be. So that's essentially the API proposal is just adding this extra attribute.
The intention is it only works in hot reload? Like, would there be any other case for it, or it's just hot reload?
It's just hot reload.
And what does the framework do with that name?
The framework doesn't do anything. The idea is that a metadata update handler can, get the custom attributes on a type and look for these original name attributes.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So what would a framework like, a UI framework or whatever
Sure.
do with that kind of information?
Yeah. So one use case is in Comet, which is a reloadable UI framework. The idea is that they can use this information to recreate the UI tree using the reloaded types. So they need to be able to relate the types that were used in the original layout of a particular view back to the updated types that we want to use instead. And so the design of Comet is stateless, so it can just replace old instances by these new instances and wire everything back up together.
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking is because in the current design proposal, you basically have a qualified name in that thing. So it's basically, abc.derived class. Another option you have is just, namespace and type as separate things. So it kind of depends on, I guess, on what a consumer would do of that. So I guess if they plug it directly into reflection, actually, I think qualified names work there, but that would be a consideration, right? Otherwise, they'd have to parse it out again, right? It's not the worst in the world, but people mess that up all the time too.
Yeah, I don't think I have a strong, suggestion that it has to be full name as opposed to namespace and name.
Yeah, I guess namespace name has other problems because now with nested types, you would have to say the type name would be, A plus B plus C. But yeah.
Does this need to be declared?
That's kind of what I was thinking as well. Couldn't it be just generated in hot reload and then recognized by the name on the attribute, basically?
So what I don't like about these things is, to me, generating an attribute makes sense when the only consumer is also the producer, right? So the compiler generates attributes and the compiler is the party consuming it. I think as soon as you have a system where tool A is producing something that a different set of tools written by a different set of people have to consume, I prefer an actual declared attribute, because that's where we can put the docs, right? As soon as we say, oh, there's public documentation on what the shape of the attribute is, but it's not actually in the API ref because we don't have a place to put it, that I think is just bad.
That's fair.
But how many people would actually be consuming this, though?
Well, to me, it's more like, is it anybody but us, right? If it's just the runtime or just the compiler, it's fine, I think. But as soon as it's a publicly thing that, we want some other third-party view framework to support, then, we make it really difficult for ourselves to to document these things. Because I think we would have to document it no matter what, right? Because we want them to be successful at it, right?
True. Okay. Okay.
And I mean, they don't cost us that much, right? There would be massive overhead on our end, and maybe it's worthwhile investing in a doc story that is kind of synthesized or something. But I mean, we could have that, right? We could kind of plug in something into the doc publishing pipeline that has these fake attributes in there, but it seems a bit over-engineered at this point.
Yeah, it's fair to have it. I just felt like it was a reasonable question to ask.
Oh, for sure.
It looks like the attribute as currently declared doesn't have the name that was passed into the constructor as a public property. And also it's specifically targeting class and not also structs and anything else that might be possibly hot reloadable. Maybe structs aren't reloadable?
No, I think that's an oversight.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So what are there any limitations on types that can be reloaded? Like what about delegates?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I need to check with Tomas.
But it's only types, right? It's not members, right? There's no such thing as a reloadable member, right?
That's right, it's types.
So I guess you just go with things that actually carry implementation. So that would be class instruct for now. And then whether we add delegate or interface would depend on what Tomasz says.
Why wouldn't we just add this to create new on metadata update? It's a, like, can this exist by itself, or does it have to be paired with create new on metadata update attribute?
So create new on metadata update is something that you put on a base class as part of your framework. And this attribute gets generated on specific subclasses of that thing in the course of editing. So the idea is that the base class is in some framework somewhere. You know, it's some abstract component class. And the derived classes are the things that the users are actually writing.
Oh, okay.
So the derived classes are the ones that are changing, and the base class is just often a framework somewhere, and the framework just says these things are hot reload aware.
So there's an interesting question in chat. Why do we use a string, not a type instance?
So that is because I couldn't think of a scenario where you'd want this thing to jump assemblies. So if you use a type, it could point off into another assembly, or it could be like some completely unrelated type. Whereas this way, it's a definition.
I mean, clearly, like, you have to have a reference to that other assembly already, right? Because you're deriving from that base type, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I mean, you wouldn't have a case where you would have cycles or anything like that, right? So you would already, like, it wouldn't be a new reference, right? It needs to be an existing one.
Yeah.
At least transitively speaking.
But you're referencing the old type that you're replacing.
Oh, sorry,
Right.
you don't. So yeah, that's true. You're not pointing to the base type. You're pointing to the other type. But,
Yeah.
But
And
I mean, logically, you're in the
I
same
worry that the whole
assembly, though,
point
right?
of I worry that the whole purpose of the hot reload is the type object would now be basically just pointing back at itself, right? Because
I don't think so. I think it's not a transparent thing, right? You will be like, if you use reflection, you will see the old type and the new type as separate things. They're not actually transparent.
But aren't you effectively wanting to get rid of the old one? And by doing this, you're basically forcing the entire chain of edits to stick around. If you change this thing 100 times and the 100th references the type for the 99th, and the type for the 99th references the type for the 98th, isn't that less than ideal?
I think they'd all reference the root.
Yeah.
Isn't it saying it's the one that's replacing, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So derived number 2. So does that point to derived number 1, or does it still point to the root?
I put points to the root, but I think it's somewhat arbitrary. But it might make sense just to have the latest in the original. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a bit odd to use a string, I would say. I mean, the only places where we use strings in the BCL is usually when we really don't want an assembly dependency, right? That's how we, go to UI types, for example, and point to the designer, which logically sits at a higher level, so you don't want to have cycles. But if you already are in the closure, it seems more sensible to have the type reference there, because then you'd have to do less work. Yes, basically there's no parsing, right? You just, you obviously stand on the type. But I'm not a runtime guy, so I can't tell what the downsides of this is. But it certainly feels a bit odd to use a string here. Now that somebody pointed it out, I can't unsee it. But yeah, if you tell me like you need a string here because you can't have a ref or something, then I'll just take your word for it.
What's the exact use cases again? Like somebody who's writing a metadata handler reads this and then goes and clears out caches that they might have with that same type. Is that the general canonical case?
So for Comet, they would do two things. One is they would clear out caches. The second thing they would do is they would recreate the UI using instances of the new classes. So they find instances of the original objects and they create the new ones and wire them into the UI hierarchy.
So for both of those cases, you definitely don't want to, like, in the case Steve mentioned where it's like there's been 100 chains, you don't want to always point back to the root. You're going to want to point back to the actual one that's being updated, right? Because when you did it the first time, when you went from derived class to derived class 1, then you went and changed all the derived classes in the UI to derived class 1. And now when you made derived class 2, you're going to want to go find all the derived class 1s that are in the app and change them to 2. Right?
I mean, that's my
Yeah,
understanding.
I think you can reconstruct that information in both cases. Like, no
How
matter
can you
which name is in
reconstruct
there.
it? How can you reconstruct it when?
I mean, if you keep track of the previous edits, you.
Yeah, presumably the framework itself is saying for the thing derived from base class, I currently understand that derived class 42 is the latest. And
Yeah.
if I get an update saying there's a new thing for base class, it's now 43 or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because of the way hot reload works, like none of the none of this is instantaneous. It's always on the next like invocation, right? So you could, I'm not sure you'll never see, something from 2 versions ago.
Yeah. Basically, if you miss an event, you would be screwed when you have to, take care of your own delta in between. But if that can't happen, then I think that's fine.
So in your case, Comet would need to keep track of all the derived classes that were created
That's
through
right.
all the edits.
Yeah.
But in the cases you mentioned, the expectation is still that somebody translates that string back to an instance of system type in order to even ask the question like, are you an instance of this type, right?
In the asynchronous case, though, Alexei, I'm not entirely sure how that would work. Let's say the current version is 42, and all of a sudden I get 2 notifications about 2 new updates, both of which referring to the base. How does the system know, like, if we're saying these things are asynchronous or whatnot, how does the system know the order in which to apply those and what they're referencing?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
You were talking about how these events are basically delayed and asynchronous, right? Because someone makes a change and it gets applied. So if I have the current version of my window, and then I get a whole bunch of notifications about new types being created because someone, very quickly made a whole bunch of edits, each one of which resulted in a notification about a new version of this type being created. If they're all referencing the base and it's the framework that's responsible for tracking the latest, how does that work versus them referencing sort of what was current at the time of the edit being made? I guess I'm just trying to understand the flow.
So I think the hot reload manager, right, that is essentially running the metadata update handlers, that runs them in order. But my point was that the derived instances I think depending on how the framework is updating the UI, if they only update like the currently displayed page or if they rewrite everything, it might see old instances get constructed that it would then have to rewrite. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay.
My point is, I think I don't see how you get away from keeping track of all the types of all the previous edits as a framework author, because you need to somehow be prepared to see any of them and to point them all to the latest one. As for how you know which one is the latest one, I think that happens because the metadata update handlers run in order of the updates because of how the hot reload agent and manager sort of do their communication.
And presumably the UI
Yeah.
framework is single-threaded, right? So that you can't have two concurrent edits, right? They would always be serialized.
Yeah.
And presumably the runtime doesn't do any replacement, right? The runtime just generates a new type, tells you that there is a new type, and then all the replacement has to happen by the UI framework. So they are responsible for, like, you know, if they get it asynchronously, it shouldn't matter, right? They process them when they get them, and they process them in order. So it seems then...
That's right. Yeah. Create on metadata update for the runtime means it's a completely new type, and we don't do anything special with it. So all the smarts have to be in the framework, in the UI framework.
Yeah, I mean, the design makes sense. I mean, I think the only changes that we discussed is basically adding a property, adding struct, and then the question was, should it be an instance of string or system.type? It probably doesn't matter considering how much work the UI framework is having to do, so they can also parse the string. And that seems fine.
Yeah.
If it's
There's
string,
also the question of if delegate applies.
Yeah.
Eric?
if it's string, we should be very clear about the format of the string. Like what, because I mean, there's a million of them. It seems like nested types are sometimes plus, sometimes slash,
Yeah.
etc.
I mean, I would say
What happens with generics, right? Like, is it a tick one? Is it whatever? It's all.
like I would say it needs to be something that you can pass to type, get type, right?
Yeah, you use the runtime representation. Nested classes use a plus, generics use a backtick, like call it a day there.
Well, the backtick's actually a compiler artifact, right?
The ECMA explicitly says generic types have a backtick followed by a digit.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how we get overloading by generic arity.
Yeah, I just thought that that was a reserved character that the compiler got to use that C# didn't allow, and that it was a implementation detail, but apparently not.
I guess I would prefer type here if doable, and fall back to string if not doable.
Yeah, I think type would make things seem easier. And then the other, I was also going to ask, if we think this is going to be weird and do weird things if anyone ever declares it, should we make the constructor be obsolete error since the tool that's going to be using it doesn't care?
I don't think anything bad happens if somebody declares it, right? What really matters is if you plug it through the runtime infrastructure, then it's fine, right?
Yeah, it might be hard to unit test your update handler if you can't create one.
Activator create instance. Gets around all manner of sins while creating all manner of sins at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, compiler services types, normally we don't bother with stuff like ebnever and hiding on them, right?
Well, there are types that the compiler knows are the compilers, and it will fail to build if you've declared it.
That is true, yeah.
You've used it. And so it feels like this probably isn't worth the compiler going out of their way to block it, but if it feels like the kind of thing that nobody should ever be declaring outside of the hot reload system, then I'm just asking, should we make even if we make it obsolete warning, like that's enough of a, you shouldn't be doing this unless you're the system that this is designed for.
Unit tests are the only thing I can think of that.
And they can suppress the warning.
Yeah, it feels weird to me that we would obsolete this.
If we wanted to hide it from people, I would just suggest EB never or do nothing because it's already in a namespace that's reserved for compiler usage.
I was about to say, our version of hiding here is to put it in a namespace that basically is infrastructure use. So anything in that namespace, you better really understand what they're for. And then, you know, the world is your oyster. I think the problem with the compiler ones is that they, you know, that people see them all the time and they decompile their code, right? And so they might accidentally copy paste stuff, and then weird stuff is happening when, you know, people basically mix attributes that the compiler is emitting with attributes that are declared, right? And that's why they're just hard to fail. But for stuff like this, it's like you have to go out of your way to use it. And then if you use it and you don't do hot reload, then, I mean, it's sure.
Okay. We also have a blurb that we put on some types saying like this API is for compiler usage only, and you shouldn't use it in your own code. Like we have a standard disclaimer for that.
I mean, this one would also be something that we would document what it does, right? And we would say, like, if you are, you know, a Vue framework and you want to participate in hot reload, then you need to reprocess, you know, events like this, and then the types have these attributes applied to them. So it's not like, oh, there's this magic thing, right? It's more like, well, here's this thing that has this purpose, and if you use it for anything else, then, well, tough luck. Yeah, I think it's fine.
So the conclusion then was use type instead of string for the parameter.
I mean, come to think of it, I would probably agree with Eric that it's better because like the problem also with type get type is that you need to know what the rules are, right? What assemblies are we probing? So unless the caller literally says, you know, type of base type dot assembly and then uses that within that assembly boundary, you might get very weird answers, right?
Yeah, generally, as was mentioned earlier, the only time we tend to use strings instead of types for representing types is if for whatever reason we can't have a direct reference to it because we need to be able to unload the assembly or because the assembly is lazily loaded or something. And that sounds like that's not the case here, correct?
Yeah.
But to be clear, that was part of my question, but sorry, I had to drop off for a minute. We're referencing the original rather than the previous, right? Because if we reference the previous, then I think you potentially do want to unload that because it's a dynamically generated thing that you then can drop when it's no longer being used.
Mm-hmm. That question's for Alexei, I guess. Like, what is it referencing?
Sorry,
is that your question?
Yeah, I had to drop off for a minute, so I don't know what was the side of it. If it's referencing the original, then there's probably fine being a type. If it's referencing the previous, referencing the type seems like it could be an issue.
Yeah, that's fair. I think okay, let me put it this way. If we say we want a string representation, then I would say let's not put in just the namespace name, then let's put in a fully qualified name, meaning assembly information as well. So you can just take that string and directly pass to type, get type, and get exactly one type back, and not like, oh, it's ambiguous or unclear what the probing order is. Or we just go with system type, and I think I would prefer the latter. Unless we absolutely cannot. But based on what Alexei said, I think it's fine to always reference the root because it seems that's, you know, it's up for the framework to keep track of whatever delta they need to keep track of anyways.
I agree.
The other advantage of keeping track of the root is that that's the name that the user wrote. And so you don't have to do any additional demangling as the UI framework if you want to, you know, throw her an error message in terms of the type that the user actually used. Right. The original name is the name that the user wrote. It's not something with a number sign and a version appended by Roslyn. So I think if we use system type of the root of the original name, there could be other benefits to that.
Okay, so it sounds like we're all in agreement here.
So let me just paste in what I have node-wise. And I can never remember the default, but I assume it's inherited false.
I don't know, may as well just write it.
Yeah, I agree.
And your the code that you have pasted in also use a string instead of type.
Of course it does, because I suck at this.
We're asking you to juggle 10 different tasks at once. You're handling it nobly.
I guess. So should we call it root type then, rather than full name? Or should we call it original type?
Yeah, that also original name in the name of the attribute kind of comes into question as well. If it's no longer a string.
And then the update original type, I guess.
Yeah, and then that suggests that the parameter name is original type. Yep.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
Ship it. And if
Thank you.
delegates can be in this system, then, you know, add delegate as a target.
All right, so then let me comment this.
I guess, or enums, or, you know, whatever. We have lots of types.
You have lots of types of types.
I see what you did there.
All right, so next one I think is the JSON one.
Yeah, so guessing this is the second round of reviewing this. We basically kind of got caught up in the design of the configuration model that would be attached to the contract customization. So if you scroll down to the final comment in the issue, this is the most up-to-date proposal based on your feedback from the previous meeting. And what I'm proposing here is that we actually define a class that we name JSON polymorphism options that essentially just has a property that is an I collection of JSON derived type. This is basically just following how the pattern followed in how custom JSON converters are specified in the JSON serializer options class. This is unlike the previous proposal, where we were defining a bespoke collection that was implementing I collection of tuple type comma object. Instead, now I'm proposing a dedicated struct called JSON derived type, which is at the bottom of this updated proposal, and that would essentially serve in place of value tuple, and the constructors would effectively serve as the validation layer for the valid and accepted type discriminator types. Type discriminator ID types. And that's it, more or less. I'm guessing people who weren't present in the previous conversation might be missing context here. So if there's something I have skipped here, please ask any questions.
So this is kind of interesting because I would say that this might actually be an example of where we might want to allow strings in addition to types to represent the name of a type. Concrete example being that I have a base library with a bunch of different plugins, and my base library is aware of all the different plugins around the system, but doesn't necessarily want to take a direct dependency on them. So if I have some base class that is the root of the hierarchy to be serialized, that base class might need to say, well, I want to allow derived A, derived B, derived C to be able to serialize across a wire. But does that mean that the base library now has to have a reference to every possible, a strong reference to every possible derived implementation that might ever exist?
I mean, if
Right,
you
so-
want to source generate it, then you always need a static reference, right?
The application would need a static reference.
Well, if you're using the attribute model, that is certainly the case. But the point of the metadata APIs is that it's specifically to avoid that necessity of the base class having a static reference to every supported derived class. The idea being that if you have such scenario, then you just directly modify the JSON contract for that class, and you enumerate the supported derived types using system.type references at runtime. But maybe I misunderstood your question.
I was looking at this in relation to the original proposal as well, where if you have an attribute on the base type, that attribute needs a strong reference to all of the derived types. It sounds like there's no way anywhere in the system, either through attributes or through the metadata system, to have a lazily loaded reference to all of the derived types. Everything has to be strong, correct?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, the precise purpose of this additional set of APIs is to avoid having a static reference at the base class definition side. You basically just define your own contract resolver where you redefine the supported derived types after the fact using regular runtime reflection. I have some examples in the same comment below. Maybe they might illuminate how this is being used. So the idea is that you define your custom contract resolver, and assuming that you found the type in question where you need to modify polymorphism configuration, you just set to the specified metadata type a new options instance with specifically defined JSON-derived types. In this case, I'm using type of, but it might be performing like an actual query of types that are assignable to derived type. I don't believe this inserts any requirement of having a static reference to every supported type.
Well, so let me try to relay what Lever was saying, because I think if you're a library author, I think you want to avoid cases where people have to inject code like the one we have on the screen right now, because it's basically something that you can't do for your user. It's something that your user has to do for you when they're using your library, right? So as a library author, I think you would probably prefer attributes, because they just live on your types, and then when people just happen to serialize your types, stuff just happens to work, right? I think the interesting thing now is what if you are a closed system of types, so you know all the derived types, but for layering reasons you ship them in, let's say 3 different assemblies, right? You have your base stuff, and then you have B and C, and so they all ship in 3 different NuGet packages as well. And so now you want to say, well, if people use A and B, it would be nice if B just deserializes automatically. And the only way a library author will be able to do that is by saying, I go to the assembly definition of A, find the derived, find the base type, and put attributes on that base type that says, okay, here's all the derived types I know about. And that's where you would have to use system.type. So now A would have to reference B and C, but that would be a cycle, so you can't do that. So basically now the library author is forced to effectively put the code that we have on screen here in some sort of docs and say, hey, when you wire me up, please call this method or copy paste this code so that stuff just works.
Yeah, so that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in that hypothetical scenario, clearly the attribute model wouldn't be necessary, and the library author would need to ship together with these 3 assemblies some additional code that users would need to explicitly plug into their JSON serializer options, or they might be surfacing their own JSON serializer options, which is a common pattern in kind of libraries that try to do interesting things with their serialization configuration. It's not impossible, but I get the feedback that it might be complicated. For what it's worth, in polymorphism in data contract serializer, it wouldn't be possible to achieve the same thing either. One possibility that was suggested in discussions in this issue was to perhaps expose a dual attribute to JSON derived type, which we might call JSON base type, where effectively you specify that the specific type is polymorphic in relation to some other base type that might be in a different assembly, but in which the derived type has a static dependency on. But this iteration does not include such an attribute.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was going to say as well. Like it is an interesting scenario, I think, and it would be interesting to see if the system could be extended to allow it in the future, perhaps. But I think I agree with you. Like it doesn't need to be done right now. Just maybe keep it in the back of your mind.
I mean, actually, it should be possible to write a library to do both what the derived type attribute does and what the suggested possible base type attribute does, because it's possible to write like a contract resolver modifier. So basically, the thing we discussed, and that would parse all of the attributes and construct the polymorphism options.
Yeah, I don't see.
Basically, the library authors could do that feature separately from the framework technically.
I don't see any reason why this couldn't be implemented in the future. And for what it's worth, users might be able to implement this attribute and then write their own, generic custom contract resolver that does this retroactively. And that's kind of the power of the feature that Christoph is building, actually. It means that people can define arbitrary attributes and give them semantics that somehow change the contract model.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Type discriminator ID. I know that we had talked about doing that as an int and a string. Why have it as an object rather than just turn the int into a string?
So the object, clearly would admit users passing arbitrary stuff there, and that would involve some sort of runtime exception if the wrong type of thing has been passed there. So I'm guessing just exposing a constructor for each of the supported types, which is just 2, and I don't expect there to be other types in the future, provides some nice compile time guarantees that you haven't messed up here.
No, I get that. I'm just asking, like, why can't we just call like int.toString and then say the type discriminator ID is just typed as string instead of object?
Because if you do toString, then it would be serialized with quotes. Like the
and you want to avoid the quotes. Okay.
Correct. Like there's a difference between a discriminator ID that is just a JSON number and a quoted 42, for example.
Yes, that
they are
makes
treated
sense.
as different.
Okay.
And would it be okay to drop the discriminator from the name? So just type ID, or just curious, like if that makes sense.
To call it type discriminator only?
No, just type ID.
I think discriminator is an important component of this, so I'd probably consider removing the ID suffix, which might be redundant. But type ID, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily, I think it kind of, we use type ID in different contexts, and in this context, we want to discriminate against multiple derived types. I'm not sure how others feel about this.
Yeah, so discriminator discriminated is technically the correct term, because you can imagine like discriminated union, for example. That said, if it's a strange name, for non-English speakers, say, then we could consider maybe using a different term there.
Again, this is borrowing from a terminology used in Entity Framework. They also call this a type discriminator, so I figured I might just steal their ideas.
Yeah, ASP.NET uses discriminator for other things too, not for serialization, but they use the terminology.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like your idea of dropping ID from it, though, and just refer to it as, the value is a type discriminator, and then we just have the type discriminator property name. That seems reasonable.
Perhaps to clarify why I'm calling this ID is that I regard the type discriminator to be the full JSON property in the object. So that includes a property name and a value, and the ID is basically just the value in the type discriminator. So
You could call it value if you wanted.
So type discriminator value?
If you wanted to keep any suffix at all.
To me personally, the ID means identifier, and that means something which identifies something. And in this case, like because we use like an int or a string to identify type, that's equivalent. So I would just call it ID, to be honest.
Sure, but if you look at this constructor, you're passing a derived type and then something called ID. Not every derived types specify a type discriminator in the first place. So I don't know. I feel that just calling it ID might not necessarily have nice self-documenting properties.
Yeah, I can agree. I actually think discriminator is an important terminology that is used to effectively say you have multiple shapes of this type, and either discriminated union or derived types. I mean, I understand what you're saying with ID and name. I think generally speaking, that's not how we do things though, because if you serialize a customer that has a zip code, you just refer to it as the zip code and not the zip code value, right? The value is almost always implied.
Yeah, I think we can drop the ID suffix for what it's worth. Type discriminator though, I think is important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because that's a concept people need to understand. And type ID would be, it's not that it's wrong, it's just it's too broad of a concept and not specific to this scenario.
Yep.
All right, I dropped
that makes sense.
Were there any other occurrences of this? I don't think so, right?
There are in the attribute.
Okay, let me just copy the whole thing then.
Eric, quick question. You had in your usage example at the bottom changing the type discriminator property name, I think, to be underscore case. I thought I remember in the PR that it had to begin with a $sign. Is that no longer the case, or did I misunderstand that?
That's no longer the case.
Okay.
Yeah. The property would still need to be at the beginning of the JSON object, together with the other metadata properties that these actually are hard-coded, and they do need to begin with a $sign. But specifically for polymorphism, we need to be lenient because we need to support schemas that don't necessarily subscribe to our dollar convention.
Got it. And I imagine you probably don't do any type of like validation in the metadata itself, but when you're deserializing, you probably have checks like, oh, the type discriminator property name also happens to match the name of a property I'm trying to bind against, or something like that.
For property specifically, it doesn't, but it will check if it conflicts, for example, with $ID or dollar values, which are some other hard-coded values that we use in our existing metadata parsing.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that usage example at the bottom, by the way. That was helpful for me. Thank you for that.
And then we also said we don't have the custom prefix either, right?
Yeah, that's been removed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me just copy paste what I have so we can do a final pass. So this is pretty much from last time, except that I removed ID from the type discriminator and I removed the custom from type discriminator property name. And then this is what we currently have here.
Looks good.
I mean, I would say, like, I don't think there's something fundamentally wrong with I collection here, but like, it's usually, I mean, it might bite us later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very deliberately picking I collection because it is a bidirectional map, so I list wouldn't be appropriate, or INumerable for that matter.
Well, it's more like you have an implementation, right, that is probably using a public type, right? If it's an internal type, it's fine because nobody can cast it, but
I'll make sure that it doesn't cast. It won't be castable to anything public. It will be a bespoke thing. We do the same thing for the other collections in JSON in JSON configuration types, anyways.
Yeah, make sure it's not just derived from a public one though either, right? You can't just derive from this.
Oh yeah.
Then,
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Just making sure, because that's usually where it's like, oh, now we exposed implementation.
I have one random final question then. For the JSON derived type attribute, you have inherited equals false. Given that this attribute is very intended to be used for type derivation scenarios, is that the correct value for that?
Yeah, so in the design, I very deliberately kind of tried to make it so that every configuration must fit on the specific declared class, and it would not leak into any base types or any derived types. So if type foo is polymorphic, all the configuration pertaining to that type should exist there and in none of the derived types, and none of the derived types should also be able to inherit configuration from the base types.
So if I have foo, which is a base type for bar, which is a base type for baz, and if at my call site I'm serializing a bar, but I pass you a baz, like, will that still work if the base type foo says I understand all of this?
So, if I remember the hierarchy, the declared type you're serializing is bar, which doesn't have any attributes.
Correct.
So in that case, there wouldn't be any polymorphism in what gets serialized. So you would need to explicitly have a declared type, or you would need to cast a value to foo, which does actually have polymorphism configuration. The polymorphism configuration in foo doesn't in any way change the polymorphic configuration in bar or baz.
Okay.
And
I assume there's an exception to that if they're using the pattern where they say that they're serializing an object and then object get type. No, because that'll be the most specific type. So, yeah.
So
yeah,
what
get
about
it from your declared type?
So maybe the better phrasing would have been, instead of foo bar baz, it's base derived and further derived. So if I'm deserializing, and at the call site to the deserialization routine, I'm trying to deserialize a derived, but the incoming payload says I am type further derived, what do I actually get back at the call site? Considering that the base class says I understand the whole thing.
So only the base class has any polymorphism attributes, is that right?
Yeah, correct. That's the only place where it's all declared.
In that case, any type discriminator metadata would get ignored, and then it would try to deserialize using the contract for the first derived class, and assuming that there is a match, then it will succeed.
Would that surprise callers? Because I could imagine callers potentially saying, like, I know that I have this full hierarchy set up in my types. I know for a fact that one of the thing that what I'm getting here isn't just the base class, it's something derived from the base class. But why would that stop me from deserializing something that is further derived?
So that's the scenario.
Like that seems like a surprise.
What I have on screen right now is what you described, right?
No, I have so I have root derived subclasses root, and then further derived subclasses derived.
So derived 2 derives from derived 1.
Oh,
right.
Sorry, yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, so basically, so this is statically typed as a thing in the middle.
Yeah.
Then you pass in something more derived, and I think your expectation is that this will just work, right?
And this actually would not it would not create any polymorphism at the moment.
Because you only look for derived 1, and derived 1 has no attributes applied to it.
Yeah, the declared type must precisely match the base class. And again, we might want to. It kind of felt to me that if we're already violating, I guess, LSP by doing polymorphism. So I'm guessing introducing the notion of polymorphism being inherited by derived classes, I'm kind of feeling that this would introduce complication that is best avoided, and we should instead only force this configuration on the base class.
So that one, so that part I agree with, right? Because if there's one place where you have to specify what the possible derived types are, I only want to do this on the base, because all the intermediaries are effectively encoded by the type system, right? The fact that derived type, derived 2 is only derived from derived 1, well, that's already expressed in the type system. I don't have to say this twice, right? So it seems it would be weird for me to say I'm expected to do this, right? Because why would I have to do this? I already said it here, right? And so
that's why I had asked, like, should inherited be true, not false?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you look at this, right? So I mean, setting inherited to true is just one way of doing it. Or logically, you could also say when you serialize this thing here, you know, you can just walk the hierarchy of derived 1 and see, oh yeah, there's a base type that has these attributes on it, so I honor those.
But the thing is, suppose you have a derived 3 that derives from root as well. If now, and you specify it as an attribute in root, then derived 1 would inherit inconsistent configuration because there's no type relationship between derived 1 and derived 3.
I agree.
I would imagine that would be an invalid cast exception or some other error at deserialization. Because during serialization, you're clearly never going to hit that because the type system won't allow you to do that during serialization. Deserialization, presumably it would just be any other I didn't understand this payload error, right?
Presumably, yeah. But I guess the question is, should this inheritance mode kick in cases where the derived class isn't specifying any attributes, or should it combine attributes from the base type and with attributes that the class itself specifies with some sort of overriding mechanism? So if I were to now add a JSON derived type attribute on derived 1 that changes the type discriminator ID specifically for, I don't know, derived 2, for example, I'm guessing that it brings many sort of questions about scoping, and I kind of felt that I don't want to go there, and I'm just going to explicitly document that, you know, your root type is.
Sure, and that's fine. I was just asking, like, would people be surprised by this? I mean, if there's documentation, then we could argue that, well, the documentation was there and you shouldn't be surprised. But
well, actually,
I can imagine people would still be surprised. So
I think documentation is an interesting word to say here, because I think that maybe what we would want to do is match the API doc syntax, which is basically have an attribute that says inherit polymorphism. You can slap it on derived 1 and say I am explicitly saying copy the polymorphism from root up to derived. And if you don't put it there, then it has no polymorphic if that's the declared type.
Yeah, I don't like that.
So anything that you put on it specifically is not merged, it is exact, and inherit conflicts with defining things, because that is nonsense.
I mean, I would prefer a model where we would say if you don't do anything, you know, it will work the way you would expect here, which is basically.
But that's the worst thing.
No, it's not, because I mean, like.
No, that's what the users want. Sorry, that's what the users who think they want polymorphism want. But from the don't serialize things you didn't mean to serialize, that's the bad thing.
No, but that's not what's happening, right? Because like if you look at the screen here, right, the thing is statically typed, right? So you can't serialize something that you can't have, because the type system doesn't allow you to do that. So what would possibly be wrong by saying if you serialize a customer, the only thing you can statically see there are things that are derived from derived 1. So that seems fine. Like, why would it not work?
Because while you can statically see the things that are derived from derived 1 in this assembly, you can't see the things that got derived from derived 1 from another assembly and get merged in at, you know, the union at runtime.
But they wouldn't have JSON derived type on them, though. They couldn't possibly have that.
Exactly, right? So if the ultimate base knows about the derived types, like logically, when I built the discriminated union, I only want to have one place where I can say here are the possible derived types, right? Having to repeat myself in the hierarchy seems bad. Being able to override it at points in hierarchies, that I'm indifferent to. I don't think anybody would want that. But if we say, look, when we serialize customer, yeah, if we find any attributes of JSON derived type on derived one, we will honor those. Otherwise, we walk all the way to the base and we honor those. But that seems the most logical model to me.
It might be worth pointing out that interfaces are also supported under this model. So assuming we do decide to do this, it becomes increasingly more complicated. Because, personally, I'm not a big fan. I'd rather users be very explicit about the specific. So I want to encourage people to do like a type-driven modeling of their type hierarchies. And if you say that foo is polymorphic, then foo and only foo is polymorphic, statically speaking. And if a derived type slips in and you use that static type, then you have a different contract.
Okay.
And in the future, I kind of like Jeremy's idea, assuming that there's demand for this. I think a flag that kind of opts into you inheriting configuration from the base class, I think that's probably preferable.
I mean, I have to be honest, I don't think that makes sense to me, quite frankly. Because I cannot imagine a world where I would want a different hierarchy. Like, there's only one hierarchy. It's just that the reason why aesthetically type something to a more derived type is because that only makes sense for this particular instance, right? But we are still just talking about the same hierarchy. We just limit the it's just a view into the hierarchy, but it's not a different hierarchy. It's just constrained to only have things that are derived from derived one. Like if you look, for example, let's say Roslyn, right? You look at the syntax APIs, right? Sometimes you have cases where, oh yeah, there's this entire syntax hierarchy which defines what are all the possible derived things. But then you have things that, I take a name here. Well, there's like 20 things derived from a name. But the only thing that makes sense here is a name, nothing else, right? So why would I now have to either explicitly say inherit those, but then inherit what exactly, right? Only things that make sense. Yeah, well, that should be the default. Why would I do anything else?
I mean, I guess I could see it. So you still can't get any types thrown into the mix if they weren't registered on the root.
No, I mean, the other way to think about this is if I do this, everything works as expected, right? As soon as I'm now restricted to things that are only possible after derived one, then all of a sudden it fails. So like, I get less, right? Not more.
I'm just thinking of it as derived 4 from some other assembly extends derived 1, and it wasn't expecting to be participating in. But
then derived 2 would have had to put the attribute on it, right?
Right, and so that's where it's because the root never talked about it. That would still only serialize as a derived 1 because it wasn't told it was allowed to go all the way up to derived 4.
Right.
Correct.
So since it doesn't involve types mysteriously being added to the serialization, or like their properties don't all of a sudden become fair game. So, which somehow that's what was happening when I was objecting, but it's not true. So, but I do agree with Eric that it's going to make the implementation very complicated and expensive and start welcoming diamonds into the world.
Yeah. So maybe like that's why I'm kind of coming down to like I think this will be a scenario that people will want in the future, but I don't think it's something that is where the current API shape as proposed here permanently, forecloses that if we want to do it in the future. And I think you've come up with options where we could opt into that.
For sure.
Eric, like if you do what we just did above, like so technically there's also JSON polymorphic attribute on the root, right? So like if we've put that same attribute on the derived one, would that start working or not? That's where I'm confused a bit, because like if I'm explicit, the JSON polymorphic tells me like, hey, this is the possible root type. And now I put the same attribute on the derived one, but at the same time, on the higher level classes, I allowed kind of some part of that hierarchy. Like that's where it becomes confusing a bit. Or would I have to basically repeat those attributes? Like, what's the?
Yeah, I would argue that this is actually wrong. Like it seems weird to me. So I cannot imagine a case where if I put attributes on a derived type, that I would have more attributes on the derived type, or like, let me rephrase, that I would include types that the ultimate base wouldn't have. Like, I would think the ultimate base is always a superset of everybody. So the only thing I would do when I go to derived 2 or derived 3 is, you know, basically copy paste everything from the base and then remove everything that doesn't happen to extend derived 1 or derived 2, depending on where I'm at. Right? And if I do, then I would honestly say that that's an error. Because I mean, logically, the property you want to retain is, if I have this, more things should be serializable than deserializable. And if I change this to a derived type, then it should just restrict what I see. It should not open up suddenly more types. But if we allow effectively that derived types have a completely disjoint set of JSON configuration, then you would allow that. And that seems wrong to me.
So I kind of agree, but like I think if we allow this to happen, then the derived one should also have the JSON polymorphic attribute, because that restricts what the root type can be and also tells you what the type discriminator, like the attribute, the property name should be.
So I mean, I think you have two options. You can either say either we can say when this happens, it's not considered polymorphic at all because it doesn't have any attributes on it.
Yep.
Or we say we do, but then it's basically honored by the base. But if we basically say, okay, what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't say if people put attributes on it here, right? And let's say I do this, right? And now I do something else. If that is missing on the base, I think this should be an error.
Why?
Because it seems weird to me that a derived type can introduce disjoint set in the hierarchy that the ultimate base can't. Because then you lose the property that if you make this a base type, you should allow more, not less.
Why though? Because I would assume that in one you're kind of modeling a serialization contract given root, and for the other you're modeling a serialization contract given derived 2, and as such they would be used in completely disjoint scenario.
Because you want to maintain that the view that the user has, like the static view that the user has, if you statically limit, it should limit at runtime as well. Statically limiting and then you're extending what you see at runtime, I think is bad, because that in case it can result in exposure of things you didn't intend.
I mean, but what I see here, line 9 would just throw away at lines 1, 2, and 3.
Right, but it now means if I change derived 2 to root, meaning I'm widening, I'm suddenly restricting. And that might be not the worst in the world, but the opposite would be, right? If I'm currently declared as root, and now I say, oh, let me statically limit this because I only ever need the derived one here. So now you're statically limiting, but then all of a sudden, inadvertently, you also are now able to deserialize this thing here. That seems bad, don't you think?
No, you declared it. Like the model is you control click until you see one of these things or you hit object. Once you see one, that's what the rules are.
Well, I think at the point where I make this decision here, I don't walk the entire hierarchy chain and think out, merge it in my head and say, oh, did I actually extend or reduce the amount of types?
But I mean, that is sort of the convention we're following in system.text.json in general. Like as soon as you change the declare type, you get different semantics. If you change it to object, then, boom, you have full-blown polymorphic serialization. Whatever public property exists in the runtime type, whether it's been opted in or not, it's suddenly exposed. So I would think that this suggests that the static type, very fully influences the serialization contract in potentially surprising ways, and I think that's actually fine.
Well, I think it is fine that you get different behavior, but I think there's an expectation of what the difference is, right? Like, basically if the static type is widening or if the static type is limiting, you would expect that behavior to carry forward to the serialization in the same way, either widening or you're limiting. But it seems very confusing to me that you get completely disjoint set of types.
If you change thing to object, then you're widening, but at the same time you're constraining, like you're basically serializing the universe. Which is arguably surprising, but again, this suggests to me that,
I mean, that's fair, but I think object is a bit of a special case, right? Because that's basically you lose all the type information at that point.
I wouldn't disagree, but I'm just saying that it basically implies that the static type of the DTO that you're trying to serialize controls everything about the actual JSON contract that you're producing, and making changes, as you call it, like widening or constraining. I don't see any kind of laws that should entail from that change in the .NET type system level. Like that shouldn't change. That doesn't imply any laws in terms of what the JSON contract should be like. In many ways, some of these things are arbitrary, and I think coming up with a few rules about how the attributes should be inherited by derived types, that might be what some users might expect, but other users might regard that as arbitrary. And back to my original point about supporting interfaces, the introduction of diamonds definitely would make this a kind of, I think what ultimately the contract that you would get in your hands would be surprising given a certain set of scenario.
Yeah, I guess my argument is if we force people to put attributes on derived types, they will inadvertently create things that they did not expect.
As in needing to copy and paste the attributes in many places?
Yeah, you have to repeat yourself, and then you have to repeat yourself consistently.
I mean, arguably, that is generally the case with all the attributes in systematic JSON. And one of the reasons why we are shipping contract customization in .NET 7 is precisely responding to this feedback. Like we have feedback from users saying, "Oh, I have I have 10,000 DTOs, and I don't want to be applying the same JSON property name attribute all over the place. Could you provide me a way to do this programmatically?" And the answer for this particular feedback as well would be, if you have this concern, if you really want to have derived types inherit the configuration from the root type, just do it programmatically.
Okay, but then, like, basically, I mean, that means the normal behavior that people probably would want, meaning, things serialized the way you would expect them to, meaning it matches the runtime. You would have to, like, say, every time you declare these things, you would also have to, effectively, when you do this for loop here, you would also have to say, okay, now I declare, the JSON derived types for derived 1 as well and for the derived 2 as well.
Personally, I don't regard this as normal, to be honest. And I think a proof of that is that, if you inherit derived type declarations from the base class, you are also inheriting things with which you have no type relationship. So I think that's a good point as to why it would be a relatively unsound thing to do.
Sorry,
and there might be
you lost me on this one. Like, what do you mean?
So if derived 1 is inheriting the configuration for derived 3, it's inheriting configuration that has no type relationship.
Well, I'm not saying it should.
Obviously.
So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that all the JSON derived things should, all the attributes should be derived. All I'm saying is that when you declare a hierarchy, it seems surprising to me that if I restrict some part of my hierarchy, I have to repeat myself. But if I now have to repeat myself, then it seems like something that will likely result in errors because I will not be able to, like, as soon as I add a new type, I may have to add it to multiple places, right? And people will probably forget, and then some things will work, and then all of a sudden it will not work, and they have a hard time debugging why it doesn't work. And that's kind of the thing I would try to avoid. But I think all the other attributes, they're a bit more scoped to the shape of this particular type, right? They're saying, okay, what casing do you want on this type, right? That seems a bit easier to understand than, this attribute, because you're effectively tying two different things together, right? You're going to the root and you enumerate the derived ones. Now having to repeat this on all the intermediaries, it's possible, but
I can undesirable. I get that, and I can see why people might expect that they want the declared derived types to work using the contract specified in the root type. And I think for that, we might consider in the future exposing a flag that at the root type, you might be able to say that, actually, enable this specific contract as the contract for the derived types as well, should they be specified. And likely this flag would not be valid for interfaces.
You mean like you would have a different attribute here, like?
There is so JSON polymorphic attribute that's already there. JSON polymorphic type. And there would be an additional property, I don't know, inherit or something.
Something like this, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
And then you would say this would be invalid for interfaces, but it would be valid for classes.
Yeah,
and then you would do the same thing. Yeah, that is something I can live with.
That doesn't pass my personal smell test. Like, I think I need to spend more time thinking about potential corner cases that such a thing might introduce, and how it, for example, it relates to derived classes defining their own sets of attributes, and how the two would interact. I'm assuming that if a derived type, if for example we have the configuration as you wrote it, and derived to it would fail because it detected that actually derived to is defining its own thing. You have a conflict. Please fix this.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's an appropriate way to go about this, right? Just to say, like, hey, we think that this is a non-scenario for us right now, but just let's make sure that if for whatever reason in the future we wanted to add it, that we're not foreclosing that opportunity with the design we have here.
There is a question on chat.
Yeah, it's why do I have to do this on the base type? What happens if I can't change the base type?
Metadata.
You have to do it in code, basically, right?
Yeah. But that's, as you had pointed out, that's the same thing. That's the same way that like EF and others work too.
Yeah.
This one I honestly don't care for. Like that, I'm generally not a fan of serializing other people's types. But that's I guess a different problem. I mean, my only concern is if we do nothing, basically, if we say, we only honor the ones on the static type. My concern is that we push people to do this, and then they create their own inconsistent universe accidentally, right? That's why I was asking, like, is there any way we can just make this not work, period, today, and say, like, you don't get to do that. You have to specify the base type.
I mean, derived to specifies a perfectly valid contract on its own. So, I mean, I don't see why users might not want to serialize it like that.
Well, I agree, but I think to me that what I don't understand is like why do you think that it's intuitive or even desirable for people to have a completely different serialization contract for derived 2 that is not just a restricted version of root? Because I think that is what people intend when they write this. I don't think anybody actually intends to say, oh, let me use a derived type and now I have a completely disjoint serialization contract for this one. I don't think that's the intention people have. And because of that, they will end up with copy pasting attributes like what I did here. And that's my only concern, that they do this, and then eventually it's just a mess. But yeah, I mean, I understand that today would be hard to restrict.
Yeah, I mean, the behavior we ship now is going to be the behavior that will be the default forever, despite the flags that we do include in the future.
Yeah.
Now, for what it's worth, I think that's fine. I kind of feel that, the do type-driven development and use the declare type that you want to influence the JSON contract. And, if that's not the case, then we will consider, even in .NET 7, shipping a flag that changes this.
Yeah, I mean, people are offended by the base type thing, but that to me is just, I understand why they say that, but I think if you think from a serialization standpoint, some party has to know the possible derived types, right? And so there is no way to do it without automatic deserialization to saying, oh, we just magically find the derived types. But that's a problem in many cases, as we have learned the hard way from binary formatter.
Yep.
So that option is not on the table. So you can just argue where to put those attributes, but it seems
for what it's worth,
is the one where they belong.
You would be able to do something a la binary formatter in the metadata. Like you
Well,
would be able to write a contract
sort of.
resolver that kind of walks the entire assembly load context for derived types and just
Oh,
declaring
sure.
them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you want fully automatic, you can, but then yeah, you have to write that code because
Yeah.
you
So
wouldn't
you
shoot
should
yourself.
people should be able to run calc via system.json, no problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to compromise my box. No, I think that's the problem, right? I think and this is kind of why I just feel like people will inadvertently do this now with the configuration as they have it.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But I'm very opinionated that this should be the design.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with saying, we don't do this, but I would prefer a design where we just block this until we decide whether we give you this option here or not. That would be my solution to
block this.
Like basically say like when people do things like this, we just tell them you can't.
As in make serialization of derived 2 impossible.
Yeah, basically if you want this to work, you have to put the base type.
Yeah. If I mark IEnumerable as polymorphic, that would block serialization for every class that implements IEnumerable.
It seems weird that you would want it to throw that you're throwing a thing that has no polymorphism defined, but its base type did.
It means that it would never deserialize correctly. I think that's what Emo was trying to get at, but it's not something that can really be done at runtime. That's more of a static analysis thing.
Yeah. I mean, what Levi said is basically true, right? So my concern is the only way to make serialization effectively sound for this scenario is to effectively repeat your attributes. And I think that's if we're convinced that's the right design, which I'm not, then sure. But I think if we allow this, we basically push people towards doing that, and then
maybe. I mean, and what you had, which I'm pretty sure, I think it said derived 2. Like derived 2 is the most derived type in your listed hierarchy on screen, so it would only ever serialize as itself, and then it would just leave off the discriminator because it wasn't polymorphic. And in this case, it would have worked exactly. If derived 3 extended derived 2, then yeah, it may not serialize a derived 3 in the derived 2 slot, but you said it was a derived 2 and you got all your derived 2 data.
Yeah, I think this is the logic model that I had. So
that was your original sample, yeah.
Okay. And basically the answer comes down to test it. Like I don't think it should fail. Like it will just fail their expectations and then they'll be confused as to why it doesn't work. But I don't think throwing makes sense either, because that now means like across assembly boundaries, hey, you can't serialize your type anymore. Why? Because the base class declared that it was polymorphic and you didn't. Like, why? Who cares? So
yeah, and for what it's worth, another thing is that you might want to serialize, derived 1 or derived 2 without any type discriminator metadata included in the wire, and making it inherit configuration would effectively make that impossible.
Yeah, so I don't think it should throw, and I think to me the onus is on someone to test their scenarios.
I mean, yes, but within reason.
No, I mean, if it violates expectations, that's certainly something to be concerned about.
Yeah, I think it does. In all honesty, I think as soon as people basically restrict this type here, they will find out that stuff doesn't work, right? And then they will find out that the way to fix it is to put attributes on the whatever the subclass is.
Yeah.
And that's basically what people will do.
But again, like speaking from experience in system.json, changing any declared type in your DTO will change the contract in sometimes surprising and sometimes not very surprising ways. So I actually quite like that aspect of system.json design. Like, the type directs everything. And, just because you changed it to something that is a subtype, that doesn't mean that you will get the same thing. out of it.
Yes.
But I hear the feedback though.
I mean, I guess it depends on your viewpoint. I think to me, it's kind of like the how surprising it is largely depending on how creative you are with your attributes. I try to be very simple with my attributes. I try to keep them in as few places as I possibly get away with. And this is a design where you effectively force me to repeat myself, and basically it forces me to a place where the problem gets worse, and there's nothing I can really do except for not using the attributes at all and just write code. That's basically the only way that I have to make it reliable, and that seems unfortunate. But it is what it is.
Yep.
And it is something that can be considered in a future release if we want to.
I don't think you can. I think the design you ship now is the thing you have, and then you will have to honor these attributes forever, right? And then we can say there's a different authoring experience you can layer on top, but basically you have to edit your stuff entirely.
Yeah. But again, I'm not sure if we could make we could make this the default if we only apply to class hierarchies and we somehow magically exclude interfaces or interfaces with diamonds.
Yeah, I think diamonds you would have to fail for, right? Which I think seems reasonable.
I don't see people serializing interfaces all that often. Like I see the far more common scenarios people serializing class hierarchies.
Yeah.
I mean, code bases that have interfaces for every single class, you would see that.
Yeah, but I do see that in code bases, but like I don't really see that in real world applications that serialize those artifacts. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying like it's not something that I would ever consider to be a primary scenario.
I would never write it like that. I agree with that.
No, I mean, we've said this multiple times on stream, right? People use interfaces because they somehow feel they're superior. But this is usually true for people that don't have to care about versioning, right? So as soon as you care about versioning, then different rules apply.
Also, I'm pretty sure the scenario doesn't work today. Like, what happens today when you use system text JSON to try to deserialize an interface?
It serializes as the interface.
No, deserialize an interface.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like, how do you create an instance of the interface?
So the short answer is for the interfaces that we recognize, we have
You have to write the converter in.
So collections basically.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the problem with saying interfaces work until they have a diamond is you get another versioning problem if the right side of the diamond and the left side of the diamond come from different assemblies. They don't know that they were making a conflict with something down the line, and now you pull in this new NuGet package and like now the universe explodes, and that's exactly the wrong model. It just doesn't. It does exactly what you told it to do. Makes sense to me. It figures things out, and that can produce problems because of diamonds. Doesn't. So I don't know. I like the explicitness. The copy pasta really should just tell people they're doing something wrong, as in they're doing polymorphism with serialization.
Yep. So, all right. So let's hit comment on this one here.
Yep.
So I think
so I guess the terse way to put this is that system text JSON polymorphism is invariant. None of the
What do you mean by invariant?
So configuration isn't inherited either in either direction, either towards supertypes or subtypes.
Right.
Yes. Which, by the way, I generally agree with. I think that's the right design. I don't like magic inheritance for these things. The only reason why I think this case is different is because the only thing we're talking here about is inheritance. So it's a bit of a... But I don't think that even if for the point that I'm arguing, I'm not arguing that the attribute itself should be marked as inherited, because I think you don't want that behavior either. You like
Yeah.
if you want some magic behavior, it would be more like, well, logically inherit the things that are derived from yourself, right? Which is different from what what the reflection semantics are.
Yeah, and again, I foresee the community creating a NuGet package with a custom resolver that implements whatever semantics are appropriate for their use cases. All right.
Alrighty, so then
Thank you very much.
one more. Anybody context in this?
Yeah.
Carlos normally would.
I think it's true. So this is a proposal for the tar file mode API that is currently used in tar entry and tar archive. But instead of using that, it's like a general solution for Unix permissions on several file and several IO APIs. So basically, it's like a copy paste of that with a couple more additions to other IO APIs. I don't know. It will be good to give context on Unix file mode or not. It's only a site direct map, I think. And other than that, it's a couple APIs and directory file for creating the file system infos with the specified Unix file mode. And then also APIs to query, to set and get the Unix file mode for file system infos and also for file handles. And that's it, basically.
There's some discussion about what this would do when running on non-Unix file systems. Isn't there a scenario where like I have like an SMB map share or something, right? I'm on a Windows machine and I'm talking with a file system that's actually Unix backed. Like, is it legitimate for me to be able to set Unix file permissions across a network like that?
I will say yes, basically because this should act on the. I think Unix it's related to the file system, right? To the OS, correct? Unix file mode.
I don't think either CIFS or Samba would transmit this data because I think it just looks like FAT32. I think they only support like a trib, so read only, and that it's up to the Samba server to know what to do with the native file system.
Got it. The reason I ask is because in the discussion here, there's talk about like having, for instance, the set APIs just straight up fail on Windows, or otherwise marking the package that has this API as Unix only. And I'm trying to figure out like, is there actually a scenario in which it could ever work? Perhaps because you're talking with another OS's file system.
So Samba wouldn't do it. If there's a driver that lets Windows mount ext4, then that could theoretically do it. I have no idea what a Windows program. I've never turned on WSL because I went to a kernel talk where the GDI Plus guys were excited that they no longer owned half the kernel space. And I went, yeah, WSL's scary, so I'll never turn it on. So I don't know how that interacts with Windows talking into the file system of WSL that's running. So I don't know if we can ever see the Unix mode and if we have APIs to call it from Win32. But I think that the default answer would be just like we have Windows specific APIs that throw on Linux, these would throw on Windows.
That is the current proposal right now.
With no attribute that says you need to do an OS check before calling it.
I mean, I think we should paint them. I assume we painted the Windows ones. So the enum wouldn't be painted dangerous, but like create directory would have. If you're on Windows, this is going to fail.
Yeah.
And similarly on Linux, it's not guaranteed to succeed. If you have if the ultimate file system that the path is pointing to is a fat system, the mode bits don't make any sense. I don't remember what chmod does when it hits that system. I think the driver returns true even though it ignores it, or it maps it to FAT32's read-only semantics or whatever. But even on Unix systems, this is a hint in edge cases.
I mean, no file API is guaranteed to work, right? Like you might not have permissions to do what you're trying to do.
Right, and basically this would call create directory. It would call, chmod, and if chmod fails, then it's probably going to throw. But so that would be up to, whatever the file system driver is doing.
Specifically, though, this won't do what you just said. This will call open, passing in the Unix file mode on the open.
Fair
so
enough.
That way you don't get into two states.
Yeah, fair enough. But so it would do, and then if that returns, hey, the file system said it didn't support this, then you'll get an exception.
Yep.
And if that says it succeeded, but it didn't work, then well, it turns out that's what the underlying API said happened. So.
But yeah, we should paint the OS not supported or whatever it's called attribute for Windows on these.
So which ones would be Mark?
All the new methods. So like open handle and create directory.
So this one we could, for example, support get and return none and only throw on set, or are we saying that we just say no on all of them?
I would only put throw on the set. There's no reason Windows couldn't log it.
Yeah, we can't have the APIs no op. Like if somebody explicitly says, I want you to set this permission and we can't honor it, like we can't silently fail. We have to throw an exception.
Yeah, and if Windows is we have no answer, then that would be nullable, I assume. I mean, or we could paint the get as doesn't work on Windows, but we don't like properties.
Well, we already have none, right? So like that's why I'm asking. So I mean, I think get we could no op to none, and then the only thing we would throw on is basically things that. But even this one is interesting, right? Let's say you say open handle and you pass in Unix file mode none. Is that expected to just work on Windows? This is the thing we can't annotate, right? So at that point we would say we could annotate now every single FileMox member except for none and say that's the way you would get this behavior.
Yes, it needs to work, otherwise you will break Windows.
Where did we move Windows ACLs to? If you have a file info, how do you get the ACLs?
I believe the entire assembly is marked as requires Windows. That's why you don't see it probably in the APIs.
Right. I'm just like, is it extension methods that are? Because we could do the same thing here. Instead of having a property that's the Unix file mode, you can have an extension method get Unix file mode that lives in a this only works or this doesn't work on Windows assembly.
Yeah, I think we said, or I should say I said that we shouldn't do that. I think I'm more a fan of like putting the APIs where they belong and then just paint them. But I think the problem with painting is now we have to decide what the behavior is, right? If we say they are painted, then it seems a bit weird to have this member none here, right? But because that's the thing we can't really data flow through, right? So we can either decide that open handle and create directory work on Windows so long you pass in none. Or we can say we throw for all of them, no matter what value you pass in, and say, sorry, you can't talk about Unix file mode at all on Windows. Which I think is better for static analysis, but it might be a bit more tricky for people that just want to write portable code.
I think all the verbs, so all the methods, should just fail. So open handle should be painted on supported OS Windows. Create directory here should be painted on supported OS Windows. Similarly, in file, open handle. The only one that's weird is, and similarly, file.get Unix file mode, unsupported OS Windows. File system info having a property and file stream options having a property, that's where it gets weird.
It seems a bit weird though to say that Unix file mode getter is supported on Windows and returns none, but then get Unix file mode given a handle would fail. Like it seems at that point you would just say, okay, we also return none on Windows.
Right, and this may be a reason that instead of a property, we want to just make it a get set method so we can paint both of them as doesn't work.
Your concern with them being properties, Jeremy, is just that they're properties and you don't like throwing from properties. Is that, I mean, platform not supported exception is special. Basically saying this API doesn't work on this platform. It's not like it happened to fail in this particular situation.
That's fair. We can paint the whole property as unsupported. Just we do have the guideline that says property gets should ideally not throw.
Right, but I think that's more of the operation tried to perform something complicated that failed. It's this thing does not work.
Fair enough.
Yeah, you don't get this at runtime, right? I mean, you will, but you mean the whole point of the attribute is to get it at compile time. I think I mean, we also have the option to mark the getter, but not the setter. Sorry, the other way around, not marking the getter. But I think I think it really depends on what behavior we want. I think we should be consistent with how and if we support none on Windows.
Well, on Windows, you also have the ability to query this information because WSL tracks it and there's Win APIs to get that information. So you can actually fully support Unix file system info and query it, even for NTFS bits, provided you've got WSL and the APIs are available. So this can work on Windows. And it may even be expected that it works on Windows considering how core WSL is to Windows now.
Yeah, that's the question, right? So if that is the case, then yeah, we wouldn't paint anything. We would just say, it's an I/O thing, so it may or may not work depending on the configuration of your system. So yeah, brace yourself, right?
Yeah, but that gets weird with the property because now you need to understand if the Git was going to throw.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general I agree, but that's not the design for the file system info thingies that we have today, right? There's plenty of properties that will throw depending on various things, right? So this would be just consistent with that.
I guess that looks like file info.length throws file not found exception.
Yeah, for example. So in that world, I think it's fine to have a property and say, yep, sorry, this may or may not work depending on the configuration of your driver.
The file system, we didn't know how to ask the question. So I guess, yeah, there'd be...
But I think that's something we should
PNSE
decide.
If there's no WSL and then an IO exception if it gave an error.
Right. Presumably none is a valid value on Unix, and it just means all bits are cleared.
Means root can do what he wants and no one else can. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, technically speaking, we could also apply the attributes later if we ever find out, oh shit, we really want to mark these APIs here because we cannot make them ever work on Windows. It would be unfortunate, but certainly doable. But based on what Tanner said, it seems might be better to just allow all of them.
If there's Win32 ways to call this, then making them work seems like goodness. I don't know that it has to work in the first version, but
you happen to know the APIs, Tanner?
Give me a second, I can pull it up. It's right here. So you're able to basically query additional metadata attached to the actual NTFS file system in the form of lxmod. $lxmod is the attribute. You can also query user ID, group owner ID, a few other bits as well.
I've yet to see an API here.
You have to use the APIs to query from the extended NTFS metadata.
Oh.
Which is a long existing
Gotcha.
API. It's been around since NTFS was created, basically.
And does that same attribute work if... So does WSL allow Windows to mount a ext or whatever drive as a drive letter on Windows?
Yep. Your entire Linux subsystem is available under its like whack WSL or something like that.
Right, but that's not a drive. I asked, can it be mounted as a drive letter?
Well, no, it's a mounted network drive. It's visible as a mounted network drive that gives you access to the entire subsystem, the entire WSL file system, including any drives that are sub-mounted from within WSL, and it's all ext4 file data.
Right, but they could be doing that with, it looks like, Samba or CIFS being the public version of the spec, which, like, did they make that look like NTFS, which I don't think they would, because that syntax usually doesn't mean NTFS. But anyway, I guess if it works, it works.
So the way I understand it is basically you have a file that appears in a Windows NT file, and Windows NT has this extended attribute syntax, right? And then you would call a different API to basically store the file mode, for example, which is you query for this attribute here. And then
right, but I think that's if you've made a directory from NTFS that is also visible inside WSL.
Correct.
And this is where chmod from the Linux side, when you call it updates this attribute in the NTFS container. My question's really it is the other way in the general mode, because like, is what you meant that from your Windows program that you're changing the Unix version of it? Because I don't know that setting this attribute is going to then go change the Windows version of permissions. So you'd have this weird, I called chmod and then run a test if I should now get access denied, and it doesn't fail because you're calling it from a Windows context, so it hits the NTFS permissions instead of the Unix permissions.
As far as I'm aware, it works bidirectionally.
Okay, they somehow magically sync this with the
WSL is integrated into the kernel in special ways to make everything work.
But they don't really change the Windows permissions based on your...
Like taking away group read from Unix, what does that mean if I have a special access group that has read on Windows? Did it take that away?
No, it only touches the Linux side attributes here.
Right.
You're literally touching an extended attribute on the NTFS file system that WSL will look at.
Right, and so I'm saying, you open, documents, foo.txt, and you say set Unix file, whatever, and you pass in that user no longer has read. And now you call file.read all bytes, and that will probably not mess with the NTFS permissions, so it's going to succeed. And you're going to be like, well, when I called set permissions, it didn't work. It's like, well, it did. You're just reading it from the wrong half of the universe.
Right. There's always going to be weirdness there, depending on whether you're coming from the NTFS side or the Unix side. But on the Unix side, which is where these permissions matter, everything ends up flowing correctly. So in a WSL context, it will end up, or from a WSL hosted program, it will end up doing the right thing.
But in a WSL hosted program, you're not asking for NTFS extended attributes. You're asking, or you're calling chmod and stat.
Right, which ends up touching the NTFS attributes.
Right, but we would be executing code that didn't say the current platform was Windows. It would say the current platform was Linux.
Right. But if you want to be able to touch or modify these from a Windows side, for example, even something as simple as I'm checking in a new shell script into Git, and I want to make sure that shell script has the right attribute set, then you want to be able to do that from Windows. That's why Git, for example, has a special command, so you can modify the Git metadata for that information and have it checked into the Git blobs as well. Like
it seems
the Windows version of Git use this API.
It seems weird to me.
Yeah, you can use that API
on Windows.
Right.
But does like the git command line actually do that?
As far as I'm aware, it does. Because there's like two scenarios. There's one, you want to modify the attributes more generally because you're just doing file crap. And the other one is, I'm expecting to modify the permissions and then access the file under those permissions, in which case on Windows, that's where it gets weird. But the same could be true for, you know, even setting attributes on Unix where it is supported and you're modifying something like an NTFS mounted drive where these permissions aren't respected anyways because it's an NTFS file system.
Right.
So you have interesting stuff either direction no matter which way you go.
Yeah, because you're blending operating systems, right? So there's doomed to be oddity. I think the question becomes is like, I think on Windows there is no API that sets the file mode, right? You would basically do it by modifying these extended attributes directly, right? So basically our implementation on Windows would basically say like, well, you know, fetch this NTFS extended attribute. If it's there, set it. If it's not there or we can't get it, then we fail the operation, right?
Yeah, although I think technically you're supposed to set it if it doesn't exist.
Yeah, whatever the semantics are. Right? All I'm saying is that we would basically emulate Unix behavior on Windows by redirecting those things against these guys, which seems reasonable. I mean, I think that's might be the expectation that then people would have. And then, yeah, as Jeremy said, if you remove an execute bit and then you create this thing, like it will work on Windows because we don't care about this bit, but it won't work on Linux. And I think that's fine. I think that's just we're not shielding the person from, we're not abstracting the operating system. It's just, we just make those API calls not insanely weird. At which point I'm okay with not marking any of them as Windows only. Of Unix only. We would just have the opinion that, we do the best we can. Which on Windows would be setting these attributes. Does anybody have an opinion on the actual API shape itself?
Specific questions or just in general?
Like, ignoring the operating system attribution. Like, do we have an opinion on the names, the shape, the usual stuff, basically?
So Steve had two of them in the comments.
Yeah. What did he say?
So the first one was, why do we need directory open handle? We don't have existing methods today. Why is create directory insufficient?
I don't know. I guess
I think it's there for symmetry only, but you can achieve the same with only the file open handle. And the reason why we are adding, that's the answer to the first question, in my opinion.
So when you say symmetry with what? I mean, we don't have an open handle today at all on directory, right? Or do we?
No, you have a file open handle on file static. I mean, we have a lot of duplicated, not duplicated, but two set of APIs most of the time for directory. So for example, directory get creation time, and then file get creation time.
No, I get that, but we don't we already have? I thought we already have file open handle, right?
Yeah, we have file open handle, so this is complementing.
Yeah, so but like we don't have an open handle API at all on directory, right? So like it's not like we have an existing one that takes all these arguments except for Unix file mode permissions, right? So basically this API here, we are basically just creating an overload that takes Unix file option, right? But on directory, we don't have an open handle API. That we would basically introduce this API on directory. That's why it's weird.
Yes.
So
we can drop it.
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
Why do we have it on file? Because like notice you get a different thing back, right? You don't get a directory info, you get a say file handle.
Yeah, and a handle can't. You can get a handle for a directory or a file. It doesn't. You can use. I think you can use the. I don't remember if there is a specific code. I think there is for if their path is a directory, you need to add like another flag to create file W or something like that.
So Eric, I didn't understand your question.
So today we have file.openhandle that returns a safe file handle. Why do we have that?
What do you mean? Well, to get the handle, or I mean, you mean why do we need to get a handle? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm confused by the question. Are you asking why did we ship file.openhandle?
Yes.
I think it's basically a low-level API to basically get basically open this thing without having to go via a stream.
Yeah, we shipped it in .NET 6, and it was going to be useful for the new APIs that Adam was working on, the random access stuff that allows you to write directly to a handle. And also there is another proposal. Well, that's different. There is another proposed API to set a bunch of properties directly to a handle just to avoid one. I mean, in case you already have one handle open, you don't need to use the path and then try to reopen the handle with the path APIs. You can use the handle directly.
And none of these scenarios apply to directory?
You can use the same API to open a handle to a directory.
Okay. You can't. Okay. Even like pre-allocation size and all the other options on that.
I guess some of the parameters will be ignored in case the path is a directory.
And when file mode is create, does it create a file or a directory?
It creates a file because I mean you're passing a new path, so
you can't do that for directories then. Because the reason you put a Unix file mode on the directory is so that when you actually create the directory, at that time it gets this file mode.
Yeah. Sorry, am I missing the question?
The question is, if we have it for file, why don't we need it for directory?
Because the same API can be used to get a handle.
We just said it can't. You just said it can't. When I said what happens with file mode is create, you said it creates a file.
Oh well, I guess there is a specific combinations that might be forbidden or that doesn't make sense for a directory. So maybe okay. So going back to the point of do we need a directory open handle? Maybe we could exclude the parameters that don't make sense for directory and have a directory open handle method.
Because directory.create directory throws if the thing already exists, right? And so if I want to say create or open this directory with this mode, Unix file mode, I can't do that today. I can't do that with just create directory, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, I think you can. I don't see why not. So the difference is that create directory won't give you back handle, and
Sorry, I'm slightly lost. Are we debating the why we need directory create directory?
No, why we have directory.openhandle in the proposal.
oh, well, we just said I was saying to him that we can drop that one.
Yeah, I think that one I thought we decided to drop, and then we can, because we don't have this today. We only have it on file, and then we, if we need it, we can add it back. But it doesn't seem like we would need it.
Okay.
And then on the file open handle one, it seems you inserted the Unix permissions somewhere in the middle. Is that right?
No, it's at the end, I think.
That's what I thought, but the very last one is still pre-allocation size.
Oh, check.
In fact, I don't think it exists at all. I think you meant to edit it, but you didn't. I think you meant to. Yeah, it doesn't exist. So we just add the at the very end we would add Unix file mode.
Yes. I think that's what happened.
And then the file mode would default to none, presumably.
It will default to the file, the default file open permissions. That's what the.
I see. Okay. And then we would mark the existing overload as editor browsable never, which makes sense.
So if we do that, then that API obviously just ignores the file mode on Windows.
Not ignore it. It would basically do the WSL stuff we talked about and call this if it works. If it doesn't, it would blow up. That would be my understanding what we would do.
I'm just talking about straight up normal Windows files.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the attributes. It's possible that you can always set them and they just do nothing unless they're mapped into a WSL system, right? In which case, our call would always succeed and would potentially do nothing useful. Or it might be that these attributes are not there, or you can't set them unless they are on a WSL enabled thing, in which case we would throw and say, sorry, we can't do that. So we would either do nothing useful or we would throw, but we wouldn't ignore it.
So we're going to be doing more things in this existing. We have an existing file open handle method.
Oh, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, I guess we would. That's a good point, actually. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. That might be a problem.
I mean, do we have to use the same pattern? At one point, Tom had it out of the proposal.
I mean, we could decide to not make it an optional parameter, right? Just have a straight up overload that, you know, you need to specify Unix file mode.
I kind of think that's my preference here. Is like we keep the existing file open handle as is, and then we make a new overload here. Because quite honestly, we've gone, 6 versions of .NET Core running on Unix without these APIs. So it's like, they're important. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm the one pushing for these, but like, I don't think they're like throw it in everybody's face important.
Well, yeah, I mean, Open Handle is one of those APIs that is not exactly mainline, right? So
also that.
Yeah, I guess this is an example where optional parameters are bad. Because you can't quite distinguish between whether somebody actually wants it or whether it just magically inserted and doing additional work. Seems bad. So then I guess the question would become, what do we do when you pass in none? Like, I guess the answer is, if you call an API that takes a Unix file mode on Windows, you would always do something. And if you don't want to spend the work, then we'll call an API that doesn't take them.
So in the notes, like right at the bottom of the screen, Tom's proposal was for on non-Unix, these things are ignored.
Yeah, I kind of agree that ignoring is, I mean, he doesn't quite say that, but you said this, right? So I think the
first bullet, the Unix create mode arg on directory.create directory, file open handle, blah, 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 are ignored.
That seems problematic.
Why?
Well, I
mean, assuming we can do the WSL thing, I don't know if anybody's for sure that that's possible. But if it's not possible.
So
I mean, if it's just setting an NTFS extended attribute, then it would work until you walk up to nobody has floppy drives anymore, a USB stick, because those tend to be formatted as FAT. And so like that doesn't have extended attributes. I don't know what the extended attribute setting Win32 function does in that case, if it is silent success or it fails. So really, I don't think we should always be passing the stuff down and just start sprinkling extended attributes all over the place. Like the Windows scenario on this is weird. Honestly, I would prefer it just throws and we ignore WSL entirely.
I think for V1, that's kind of my preference is not to do the WSL thing. And then I don't know about throwing or ignoring, but
I'd rather ignore, because I'm pretty sure that's what Unix does. And that seems like if Unix is going to do that already for unrecognized file systems, then it seems reasonable for that to be the default behavior for unrecognized file systems, technically speaking, for .NET. So if we say Windows support doesn't exist in V1 and Unix says do nothing, basically no op, then Windows should no op as well.
So I wasn't aware that Unix already has the ignore behavior. If that's the case, then I think it seems very reasonable to extend that to Windows.
Yeah, if that's
I'm not positive it does that in all cases, and it's worth checking. But if that is the behavior, that's what I think.
Yeah, basically the test would be on Linux, mount SMB and mount something that's directly FAT. And then tech, go ahead and try the dangerous mount NTFS in write mode, and see what happens when you call create with the mode bits. If they just get thrown away, then now we have precedent. If they fail, then now we have precedent.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't want to completely punt it from V1 though, because I think we need to design the APIs with the possible behaviors in mind, right? So if we have a world where we always ignore, then the API shape doesn't really matter because we can always drop them on the floor. If we want to create a world where sometimes we throw and sometimes we don't, and it should be somewhat, understandable for the caller what behavior they're getting, then I think, again, the API shape needs to follow. And if we say, okay, we have some APIs where we do extra work on Windows and that might be expensive, so we want people to opt into that behavior explicitly, then again, this impacts the API shape. So I think we need to understand, what the behavior on Windows ought to be. And I think that means we need to understand, like, okay, is dropping always an option? Is emulating via WSL desirable? Is it, does it have perf implications? Because I think that, scoping this out from V1, if it impacts API shape, seems like a bad idea. I mean, we can still decide not to do work, right? But I think we need to understand what the long-term vision is, and then say, okay, do the APIs fit this, right? Because it would be bad if we ship a bunch of APIs and then in V2 we realize this is all a mistake, and then have to obsolete them and introduce different APIs. So I think in that sense we need to answer this now.
So what's wrong with the proposal on the screen?
So the concern that we have, I think, is so let's say, okay, if ignoring is an option, I think the API shape is fine. If ignoring is not an option and we say we either fail or we do something useful, which is I think what I heard initially, then the question now becomes, is it okay if we always set the Unix file mode on Windows now, even if somebody may not have wanted that, in which case you would have to think about how we deal with this optional parameter now. And I think other things also apply to, I guess, the file modes properties, right? Because the question is, what happens when you instantiate these file system infos? Do they have a default value? If so, do we set it? And there's another question in chat, which is, it seems WSL has the notion of defaults for these flags. But I don't know how they're being controlled. But if they are basically filled in by the driver level, then if you call open handle, for example, and we have a default value of this mask, would we always override it? Or would we say, like, okay, we honor the ones that are there, and if they are not there, then we set them or something?
Okay.
What if the proposal is just throw? You're on Windows, you call this thing throw. Like, because kind of my concern is these are valuable, useful things for people working on Unix.
Right.
And we're going to derail it by saying, well, we don't know what we can do on Windows, so let's not do anything on Unix, right? Where, like, the Windows case is extreme corner case kinds of things, right?
I mean, in a sense, yes, but I mean, I think that's not entirely unreasonable, right? I think the goal that we have for .NET is not just to give a bunch of APIs that are useful on one platform or the other, right? The goal is to have APIs that work sensibly in a cross-platform fashion. So in that sense, it's completely fine to say we have Unix-specific APIs that always store on Windows. So that's a reasonable design point, right? All I'm saying is that we need to understand what the design point is, right? If the intention is long-term, we have some things that work on Windows and some things that don't work on Windows. Like, okay, is the API shape that we have suitable for this behavior, right? So one problem that I see is with this default parameter, for example, is that might not be the case. If we say there's always separate APIs and there's a specific overload that a person opts into, then failing seems totally fine. It's also fine to make things work. And it's also fine to say these new things have a perf overhead because, well, you opted into them, right? So in that sense, the only problematic API, I think, is really open handle. Because that's the thing that kind of means new code would suddenly call this API and pass in Unix file mode default file option, file open permissions, right? And well, if that always throws, that's bad. If that occurs perf overhead, well, that's probably bad given this API is, automatically chosen now for you. And the API was meant as a low-level alternative. So I guess if we remove OpenHandle entirely, then I think the API proposal as on the screen seems fine. If we want to have it, then I think I would make it an overload where nothing is optional. Sorry, where everything but Unix file mode is optional.
So that means it would go second in that case?
Yeah, I guess that would be bad, right? It would be very convenient to call. Can we make everything optional? I think it should still work, right? Or does this introduce ambiguity?
That introduces ambiguity with the existing. What if it was just everything was, you needed to specify everything? I mean, it wouldn't be very easy to call it, but.
Yeah. I mean, we could also call it OpenHandle Unix, right? And then make everything optional, right? That also works. That might be slightly less appalling.
Yeah.
There is another way to open handle. If you create a file stream and then call get call the save file handle property in it. That's another way of getting it. And also you can set the Unix file mode by using the file stream option new property.
Yeah, you could also do this, right? You could just call this guy here, right?
Yeah,
you just use the existing OpenHandle and then you just have one additional call. Maybe that's fine.
Yes.
I mean, I would assume that this call is super cheap because you're standing already on the handle. But it's probably not free.
You do want to set it when you create the file.
Because of timing?
Right. Like you don't, like for security things, you don't want like a time where the file's visible outside of what you're intending.
I see. Yeah, that's a fair point.
Well, the other method I mentioned can achieve that.
Well, we could
right,
also
with the
make
file stream.
So another option we have is we could also make it nullable, right? At which point we can say it defaults to null. So on Windows, it literally does nothing. Like it would just pass in null and then we do nothing. If you want on Windows to set a file mode, well, you set it to something other than null. And then on Linux, same thing, right? And then we could say we can actually introduce it as it's proposed here as a new overload where everything is optional. We would just have a way to distinguish between you meant to set something and you meant to not set something. But of course, you increase the size now by 1 byte. Are people okay with that?
I think that's a decent alternative.
That even means
the same.
That would even mean on Windows we could say, take the default from whatever WSL decided. That also solves that problem.
Do we do the same thing on file stream options?
File stream options.
Or Unix file mode, called Unix create mode. It's at the very bottom of the screen. We make that nullable as well.
I mean, you're standing on a stream, right? The stream, or are you creating the options and then pass it to something else?
Right, file stream options is the options you pass in when you want to make a file stream.
Yeah, then it should be nullable. Like file system info, you're already standing on it, right? So it basically has a value, right? So basically we can always say, well, if there is none, then there's none, right? But at that point we know what the value is, right? And on Windows, we could lie and say it's always none if we don't want to do the WSL route. Agreed?
I didn't catch it.
So
like on file stream options, do we make that thing nullable?
So I would make this nullable, and I would make this not nullable because you're standing on one already. So you already have an answer. Right? It's the same as this one here, right? We read the one we have, and on Windows, maybe we return none or we throw, depending on how we want to implement this.
Right.
So the only thing becoming nullable is file stream options.
File stream options, and then the parameter to open handle, yeah.
Right.
And then I assume we would not make it nullable on create directory because you just call the overload that doesn't take it.
Yeah, unless there's a cascade problem and we want to put it in there so we can have defaulted parameters, etc.
Well, there's only one argument right now, which is path. So it seems
there's actually two. There's another overload for create directory that's string path and directory security.
So that's the Windows one. Yeah, so that
right, exactly.
So that actually makes sense, right? So you can either say use the platform default or use the particular platform value you want. The only problem is now if you want something that on Windows sets the Windows permissions and also the WSL ones, you're kind of screwed.
Well, do we have that one on core?
Which one?
Yeah, that's a good point. It is not on core.
Yeah, because
I was just looking at APIs of .NET.
We moved it to like the permissions extensions for files thing.
Yeah. Now that I said it, that might actually bite us later. Right? If we actually want to support the WSL entries on Windows and we want to follow best practices, then you want APIs where you can set both.
Yeah, because what we have now is file system ACL extensions that create directory of this directory security and a string.
Yeah.
Because the directory types they're not available to the IO layer.
Yeah, that kind of makes me believe that emulation is bad here. Because if you think it through, right, now that means every single operating system results in an API that has to take all of them. Right? That would be pretty terrible.
So since Windows has to go through a different indirection on core, and this method certainly won't apply to framework, do we want to, instead of just overloading it, do we want to call it create directory Unix? So it's just clear we're in a different thing and we don't have to worry about overload cascades and defaults and combinatorics and stuff later?
I mean, it would be weird to just do it for create directory though, right?
Were we going to do it for file open handle as well though?
Yeah, if we want, I mean, that's the question, right? I would, if we think that's useful, I would do it for all of them, but I'm honestly not so sure that it is. I mean,
does
it would
open
be
handle have a Windows Z specific version?
It does not today, but there might also be. I mean, I guess this is the question, right? This is a low-level API, right? For perf reasons. So I mean, I'm actually not sure how much people care about ACLs these days. Because I feel like if you're in a service or a Docker container, it's a temporary file anyway, probably. So you throw it away. Because
I thought we were getting rid of open handle right now.
On directory, yes, not on file. File already shipped.
Because well, it didn't ship with Unix file mode.
No, that's true. We don't have one for Unix file mode, right? That's the one we would add the overload to.
Right. So it's sort of, if we don't have a way to do it with Windows of open this file, and if it doesn't already exist, create it and apply these ACLs, then maybe until we figure out how we want to do that for Windows, we shouldn't do it for Unix, and then we should figure out what OS variant overloads of these look like, of whether they're overloads or whether they get OS suffixes so that we don't have combinatorics problems later, or what.
So you're saying there is no way I can create a directory right now without creating it first and then setting the permissions? Our ACL ones
I don't think that there's a way that you can get the file handle atomically in that. I think you'll have to have done something like create and then read the handle off the stream.
Oh, sorry, you meant the if you want to get a handle, yes. But we do have directory ECL extensions or something where you can create a directory and pass in the Windows ECLs, right?
We have file system ECL extensions dot create, which
takes the path and the Windows.
Takes a file info or a directory info and a directory security.
Yeah.
And then we have create directory, which takes a directory security and a path.
Yeah.
And so we have the abilities to do this, but they don't live on these types. And they have a different, so.
Yeah, but that was, I mean, I think the reason why they didn't live there was because we didn't want to put Windows-specific APIs in the core because the closure of those was huge. So we wanted them in a separate assembly.
Well, I think we also have that like system IO literally can't even see the security, like that. It can't see the ACLs class.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So the closure of the ACL types was too big, so we didn't want to put it in Corelib, I think. But I think from a layering standpoint, that's a layering decision, right? More than a usability decision, right? Like if we could have, I think we probably would have and just marked them as Windows only.
I just think if we leave OpenHandle out of this now and talk about it in a different issue, we can figure out what we want the combinations to be. I don't see a way that we have OpenHandle at all for with the directory security. And if we have using the file system info version and then calling create, you can have said go create the file with this Unix file mode already. So you have the ability to call create and then get the handle from it, which is the only way you can do it with directory security on Windows.
Yeah.
So I'm just like shooting for parity while making sure that we don't end up closing off overloads. It sounds defensive and safe to me. If we start adding more complicated versions of OpenHandle and we have to keep transporting the Unix file mode around just because of the combinatorics of defaults like that, I don't know we want to start getting committed to that. That's the only thing I'm trying to avoid. If nobody else thinks it's a real issue, then whatever. I'm not saying no, I'm just saying apply caution.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. I think if we remove OpenHandle, I think this is a relatively straightforward API proposal.
I think I'd be fine with just dropping open handles across the board here, because if you really want to do it right, if you want to make sure you create a new file with this Unix file mode, then create a file stream with the file stream options, set the Unix create mode. Yeah, I mean, there might be some slight little performance thing because you have to create a stream object, right, et cetera, but you can get the scenario done with what you want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then in terms of API, so we would basically still make file stream options Unix create mode nullable, which would be the default.
I think so.
And then we can still decide whether we do something on Windows or throw.
So I think file system info probably also needs to be nullable.
Well, I would say it has the same behavior as get Unix file mode on file.
Well, the problem is because you can call. I think that you can call file info.create, which means you can make a file info describing what you want the file to look like and then call create. So I think setting the.
I think so. You're basically saying it's a templated thing, so you can create a file system info without having it already baked by something on disk, and then once you're happy, you call create.
And so if you so when we create it, we then have the same problem of we need to know where you're trying to set the file mode, or is it default file mode?
God.
Certainly, it could track internally. Have you called the setter?
Yeah.
But
I think I agree with you. I mean, I think making it nullable would be awkward, but I think that's probably the right decision. Yeah.
Because of the create Because of the create path.
Because of
Yeah.
fileinfo.create.
Yeah, because otherwise you would have to say, well, we set it to something like none, and then when you call create, well, now we initialize it with none, which might not be what you wanted.
Yeah. Did you mean none or did you mean
Default.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of sucks though.
What else can you set?
Is read only?
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say.
It seems to be the only other thing on, at least that's on file info. File system info may have some more stuff. You might be able to specify the creation time and last write time and stuff on create. I don't know how many of these are respected. This is the problem with objects that do too much.
Right.
If create doesn't listen to anything else, because it would be weird that if you called create and then set Unix file mode that it mattered, but if you set Unix file mode and then called create, it didn't. And so either the object needs to keep track of, have you actually called the setter? If yes, we need to do what you called set to, but that's weird because now if you say Unix file mode equal Unix file mode, you're different than if you never called that. So it gets weird. Alternatively, no, we can't say create should throw if you called set on it ahead of time, because that'd be weird too. Nullable, I think, is the only thing that makes sense. And then Windows can just return null.
And when you're on Unix, it never returns null. And setting it to null.
Setting it to null if it already exists would probably throw. Maybe. Setting it to null and it didn't exist and then you call create means do the default thing.
Yeah, which might be ignore or apply WSL default or whatever we want to cook up.
Yeah, file stream options, nullable, 100%. File system info, if we didn't have create, it would be non-null and throw, but we do have create, so I think it has to be treated like file stream options, and it's just weird when you're asking about a file that exists, because if file exists and you're on Unix, then 99.999% likelihood that it's not null. In fact, it may be 100% because I think stat will always give an answer. It's just not necessarily a sensible answer. Yeah, Windows, it would always return null. Unix, it would not. Cross-platform I/O is hard once you want to get picky.
Yeah, this is an example where cross-platform design is actually legitimately difficult. But I think as a general principle, I don't like when we have to make multiple platforms work from a single API, like meaning a single method. I think I think I'd prefer a design where we can say, you know, we have a single type that works across platforms, and then there are some members that are only working on one platform, or the members cross. But
the other answer for Unix file mode on file system info is don't be a property, be a get and set method, and that's not just for OS attributes. That's so we can be very clear that it does not apply to create.
Yeah, and then if we want create, I'd rather have a design where we have an options type, and then we have Windows eccles on it, and we have, you know, Unix file mode on it, and then the individual members, but they're not parameters.
Yeah,
so if we really want to make them, you know, as a single operation kind of thing.
Yeah, so again, the reason for splitting the get and set is because these properties do not apply across, like it doesn't apply across this transition. So get would always be a live query to get, set would just be a call to set. And if the file does not exist, then get's gonna throw, probably, because that's what like length does if the file doesn't exist. I think I like that better than nullable.
So then.
Say it again. Say it again about Git.
Yeah,
we
didn't
would never
API.
cache it like we do to everything else. Like
Well,
we cache like
think...
the write time, right?
Fair enough. But like length, I don't think we do.
Actually, I don't know.
Yeah, length is live, I think. No, it says there's a cache. Okay. It looks like things get cached. So the get method can do what, the length property does, etc. That's fine.
Right. And then the set always goes to the
But set would throw if the file doesn't exist.
Right. It always goes to the disk, like it happens now.
Yeah.
And
so basically that means file system info would be non-nullable. But we would know whether you set it or not.
File system info would be not a property.
It'd be two
Make it a
methods.
method, get Unix file mode, and set Unix file mode. Because then you couldn't have set the property before calling create.
And if you try setting it, it goes to try to set it on disk, and it's like, this file doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Because that's actually what time does. Creation time. Is you say new file info, c:temp, .junk or whatever, and then you say set creation time. And I never called, f.create. I just said f.creation time equals some time. And it says file not found exception, could not find file.
Yeah.
So
why couldn't the Unix file mode do the same thing?
I mean, I guess that's true.
Then we wouldn't have to be nullable at all, right?
I guess that's true. It could just be a property that can't create, the set would throw, the file didn't exist.
Basically, the general rule is just do the same thing we do for all the time properties.
So how do I know create a file with Unix file mode? I can't. I basically can only set it after the fact. Is that the idea?
No, file stream options.
Yeah.
Lets you.
Yeah, but
when you say new file stream,
but you can't create it from a file system info.
Yeah, so if I do the file system info thing, then I'm kind of screwed. I basically have to do it after the fact, which seems unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree. It does look like, okay, so the only thing that you can do with fileinfo.create is you say new fileinfo.create, because all the other property sets are going to throw. So given that that's the way that the rest of them work, yeah, it doesn't need to be nullable. It'll just behave like everything else.
Oh, you're saying that path is already kind of screwed. So
yeah, you can't say file info dot last write time equal something and then call file info dot create. It won't create a file with that last write time. The call to last write time will have now gone to the disk to go see. Like, great, go look up the file. It doesn't exist. Can't set the right time. Throw.
Yeah, I mean, another way to think about it is like, do we need it at all on file system info? I mean, we don't give you the ACLs where file system info either, right? Or do we?
We did on Windows.
Oh, we do have we have an extension method that returns it. I guess we could do that. Yeah, fair enough.
At least I assume we did on Windows.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier that the extension methods over file system info. I think. ACL extensions. What is that? Yeah. We have get access control over directory info. And we have it over file info. Yeah.
Oh, because I'm looking at file system info right now.
Yeah. So that would be be an argument to keep it on file system info. At least you can get it now.
Yeah, and as Eric pointed out, the sets on everything else is already they're throwing if the file doesn't exist.
So then I guess we would. God, where is it?
We take the nullable off of the file system info property.
Yeah.
And keep it a property.
I mean, the file system info APIs are kind of weird anyways.
Yeah, like Jeremy said, they do too much.
They not only do too much, they also do it at weird points in time.
Yep.
And I think it seems weird to me that you can like construct an object that is meant to represent a thing that exists, and then you make it pop into existence by calling a method like that. It seems like a weird pattern.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a. Do you show framework 1.1 in your tool, or do you just start it too?
Always have. I mean, that was literally the number one thing that this thing does.
But does it or does it not make the distinction between .NET Framework 1.0 and 2.0?
Oh, it does. 1.0, 1.1, they're all listed.
Okay. Because it looks like file info came out, or
file info exists since
get access
1.0.
control came in too.
Yeah.
File info's been since 1.0. Yeah. So I think this is a pre-API review type.
Yeah, I blame Christoph. All right, so then we're happy with this.
The only thing I have a question about is the two enum helpers.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to talk about the last one. So the last one I don't think we need anymore, right? Because this was just the default parameter for open handle.
Right.
And then the permission mask, I'm kind of fine with having that. I mean, we do have other. I mean, I think it's fine to have an enum with mask members on them. The only rule we said is we are not fine with sentinel values, but that's not a sentinel value.
Well,
really.
So it would be weird because if you actually had something that was 0777 and you call toString, it's going to say access permission mask.
Oh, that's how flags the enums work.
Yeah, that's how they
if
work.
If it finds a mask that matches, if it finds a combination that matches, that's what toString will do. So I think we want to drop both of them.
I'd be okay with that.
Oh man.
I mean, if we really wanted to, we could someday go add that mask somewhere else, like on.
I mean, you could
as a const or something.
One thing you could do is you can also add a first member that is all, like so not a first, like a second member that is all, because they are still evaluated in order. So that means if you have something that has set all, and you would toString it, you just get back all. And then we can still have permission mask for code clarity with the same value.
Permission mask doesn't do all, right?
Yeah, permission mask leaves off the last three.
Yeah. It's only user, group, and other, read, write, execute. It's only those. It's not the sticky bit, set group, set user stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could also have a member that is literally user group other, right? But then, yeah. That might not be bad.
We can always add them. We can always add them later.
Yeah, we can add them later. We can figure out a place to put some consts. Like we can expose the consts without making them members of the enum.
Yeah, we could, but that's weird. Because we don't really have a place for it.
Yeah. So my feeling is get rid of the masks so the toString's not weird.
Yeah, and if you wanted to edit, I would just edit under user group other and then call it good. And then you can use it as a mask, and toString wouldn't be too weird.
All right. Are we good at 50 minutes over?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
we're getting rid of the bottom two, right? Oh, did you update it?
Right. Happy with this?
I think I am.
I think
file get Unix file mode and set Unix file mode, taking safe handles. You can easily get safe handles from stuff, right? We don't need that with path.
Yeah, we may want to overload with path. That seems reasonable, actually.
Fair enough. Why didn't he do that in the first place?
That is probably actually the API, the number one API that is being used here. Or do we call it string path or string file path?
String path, yeah, I think so.
Get last access time calls it string path. I don't see anything on file that takes the handle.
This is a new proposal. It's a separate issue that it was approved, and there's an open PR for.
Okay. All right. So yeah, overload those across the file handle and the path, and then I think we're done.
So
I think then we're done.
Please.
So yeah, Tom did take those out. He had them originally. He took them out for just new file system info path .unix file mode.
Yeah, but that seems
Inconsistent.
yeah, and also overly verbose.
Yeah.
Huzzah.
Hallelujah. All right, so then
Thank you.
That was easy. Well, at least we got to the red ones. The 3 ones I set up to do. And then, yeah. Oh well. See you all on Thursday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.